Okay, so thank you very much, Rabbi Geffen, and thank you very much to all of you. It's so nice to meet you, and it's really a tremendous zechus. It's a tremendous honor for me to be here, to have the opportunity to share a few thoughts today. I've been an admirer of the yeshiva for a long time, of Ohr Somayach, and I think I had been here once before visiting briefly, but as Rabbi Geffen took me through the building a little bit this morning and introduced me to a few people, I have to say each and every one of you, like without fail, that I had the chance to meet today, I'm inspired. Everybody here.
You said Kerry is going to Torah anytime?
I'm sorry? Oh, it is? Okay, perfect. Yeah, no problem. Everybody I'm meeting here this morning, I'm really inspired by. I think everybody has a story of how you got here, how you got connected to Ohr Somayach, what brought you here to learn and to connect more to your Judaism. So it's really an immense pleasure. So what I'd like to do today in the next 35 or 40 minutes or so is just focus on some Chumash, specifically Sefer, the book of Shemos, names, and not really go through text so much. I'm not sure what you normally do in your Chumash class, but maybe go through a few psukim, a few verses, but really travel, if I could take some liberty, travel a little bit through the whole book of Shemos, all the different parshas, the different weekly portions, and pull out a few ideas that have really inspired me. These are not my ideas. These are ideas that I've found or learned, but ideas that we can take from the Chumash and really apply to our lives and really try to walk away with a message that we can carry forth. So feel free as we go. If you want to stop me, you want to ask a question, comment, suggestions, maybe at the end you want to rebut what I'm saying, it's all well. So by way of introduction, before I get into the Chumash, let me share a mashal, a parable that I've heard from one of my Rabbeim, Rav Moshe Weinberger from New York. And this has, perhaps some of you have heard of him. I heard him say this a number of years ago. And when I have the opportunity to speak, as Rabbi Geffen mentioned, and I am, as Rabbi Geffen said, primarily in the business world. We have I'm happy to explain more later if anyone's interested. We have a family-owned business where we have numerous manufacturing plants. We manufacture liquid eggs, frozen eggs, hard-boiled eggs, omelets and patties, anything and everything having to do with eggs. Primarily, we sell to national restaurant chains all over the United States, major manufacturers who use eggs as an ingredient. We have 4 manufacturing plants in the United States, and believe it or not, we actually have a plant in Meron as well, here in Israel. So I'm not here on business. I'm here on inspiration and Torah, and supporting soldiers and visiting army bases and learning with my son, who's in another yeshiva where I had the opportunity to speak last night. But that's what I do in my day job. And as Rabbi Geffen alluded to, I do have a passion for growing in my own Judaism and connecting deeper to my Judaism. And so I've, in recent years, gotten involved in different Jewish outreach programs and had the chance to speak and share some stories, etc. So by way of introduction, here is the mashal, the parable. And if you take away nothing else from this talk, from this class today, perhaps the following will be something that resonates with you. Imagine 150 years ago, back in Eastern Europe, there was a small shtetl, a small little village. And back at the time, obviously, there was no recordings, no electronics, etc. And a lot of the Jews in the shtetl were very poor and really struggled to support their families. And this particular Jew had very little money and really had a hard time supporting his family. He had a lot of worries in life, a lot of challenges and a lot of worries. And you can imagine in those days in the shtetls, there's not a lot to distract them from their daily worries. And one day somebody comes by and sings him what we call I don't even know if it's a Hebrew word, or I think it's a Hebrew, a Niggun, a Niggun. Is that Hebrew or Yiddish? I think it's Hebrew, I don't know. But sings him a Niggun, sings him a tune. And for those few minutes, he's so inspired. You ever have an experience where you hear, I don't know if anyone here is musically inclined, but you sometimes hear a really inspiring song that just touches your neshama, touches your soul, and it really sort of carries you, uplifts you for those few minutes? Well, that's what happened. He hears this unbelievable Niggun, this unbelievable song, and for those 3 or 4 minutes, it's such a relief because he forgets all of his worries. It literally clears his mind and takes him away from everything. The problem is, of course, it's not recorded, right? There's no electronics. And this person who sings him the song leaves. And the next day he wakes up and he says, I was so inspired by that Niggun, by that song. he's trying to remember the song, but he doesn't remember it. And so he starts talking to a few of his friends, and he said, somebody sang me this Niggun, this song, and it really inspired me. Maybe you could sing it to me. But they obviously didn't know exactly what song they're talking about. So they would try to sing different Niggunim, different songs, but he kept saying that's not it. And as the days went on, he became more and more obsessed with his search for the lost Niggun. And he started traveling to the next town and to the next town, asking more people. And every now and then he would hear like a note or a chord that sounded very similar. And he would say to himself, that might be the Niggun I'm searching for. And then after a few more notes and chords, he realized that's not it. It sounded like it, but it's not. And he eventually spends his life traveling from what's called one Baal Menagin to another, one professional singer to another, trying to describe this song, this Niggun, and seeing if these professional singers can recreate it. And he spends the rest of his life in search of the lost Niggun. That's the parable. That's the mashal. The nimshal, the point that we take out of this story is as follows. It's well known, perhaps some of you heard this. There's a teaching that when a child is not yet born, is in the mother's womb, a malach, an angel, comes and teaches the child, the unborn child, all of Torah. Teaches the child everything. And then right before the child is born, the child gets a tap like on his lip, and the child comes into this world. I'll say it differently. The soul then goes into a body and descends into this physical world. Now, I speak for myself. Maybe some of you can relate to this, but we spend the rest of our lives in search of that lost Niggun. What does that mean? Our neshamas, our souls, have tasted something in another world from before it came into the world. We knew Torah. We were taught all of Torah. We were taught what it means to connect to God. And our soul was very fulfilled by that feeling. But then the soul descends into a physical world, and we're in search of that lost Niggun our whole lives. We're in search of that happiness. And what do? So how many people here are from America? You're mostly Americans? Okay. So Rabbi Geffen's not a big basketball guy. I like how he introduced my basketball coaching. I did coach for 16 years. Perhaps some of you heard of it at an Orthodox Jewish high school in the New York area called MTA, which is Yeshivat University High School. I coached there for 16 years. And actually I stopped about 8 years ago. It was around the time I was starting to get more inspired myself. And when I reached the point in life where I didn't want to spend my extra hour running a practice or coaching a game, but I wanted to sit with a Sefer or go to a Rav Weinberger shir or whatever the case may be, I said, if I can't give 110%, I'm not going to do it. But to use a sports analogy, we spend our lives traveling from one Baal Menagin to another. Whatever that Baal Menagin, that professional singer in your life may be. It could be the Yankees, it could be the Mets, it could be a mansion, it could be an amazing vacation. And by the way, I'll just give my own humble opinion. There's nothing wrong with enjoying some of those things, but when we feel that that's the Niggun we're searching for in life, the soul is just going to be empty. And so we spend our lives in search of that lost Niggun. But the reality is that the soul is seeking something much higher, something that it knew once upon a time. And that's the search for the lost Niggun. So I'm sorry for giving a long introduction, but as we get into Chumash and as you progress in your learning, I think that's just a good way to keep everything into context. When you're trying to grow in your Judaism, you're really looking for the true Niggun in life, the true tune that your soul is looking for, rather than some of the things that could lead us astray. So with that introduction, what I thought I'd do is I would just pick out a few ideas from different parshas, from different weekly Torah portions throughout the whole book of Shemos, and like I said, relate to some inspiring things that maybe we can connect in our lives. So we just finished the whole book of Bereshis, right? The whole book of Bereshis. If you think back about all the different parshas of Bereshis, what was Bereshis? What would you say the theme of Bereshis was? I think the theme of Bereshis, I would say, aside from creation, obviously, we learned a lot about the avos and the imahos, our forefathers and our mothers, and we learned a lot about their personalities, and obviously about Avram Avinu, about Abraham, who was found God, monotheism. But really, I think the book of Bereshis is a lot about building the individual, learning from the avos and imahos, our forefathers, as individuals, how we should build ourselves. As we transition now to Sefer Shemos, the Shvatim, the 12 tribes, are leaving the scene for the most part. And now we're moving to a new phase in Jewish history, and it's really about nation building. It's really about building the nation of Klal Yisrael instead of individuals. The very first parsha the very first Torah portion in Shemos. And this is from a brand new Sefer. I'm very close. My family's very zocha, very privileged to have a close connection to Rabbi Yisrael Meir Druk, a very, very big tzaddik here in Yerushalayim. I have to introduce Rabbi Geffen to him. He actually was the chavrusa, the learning partner of Rav Chaim Kanievsky for 32 years. So really, really, and my family has a real privilege to be close with him. He just came out with Sefer Shemos of this. It's called Lahavos Eish. It's his 54th Sefer. And we were with him the other day. He told me his goal in life is to write 200 Sfarim, 200 books. And by the way, he starts his day every morning except for Shabbos because it's a long walk. At 4:20 a.m., he gives a Gemara shir in a classroom right above the Kotel every morning. 4:20 a.m., he goes pretty much till 1 o'clock at night and starts again the next day with a 4:20 shir. And somehow he has a time to write about a sefer a month. So it's when you think about what we can do in life, what we can squeeze out of ourselves, there's always more to give. And so he just came out with this Sefer Shemos. And he presents a very, very nice idea here in the very first verse, the very first pasuk of Sefer Shemos. He says the following. The first pasuk, and you could, if you have a chumash, you could follow along, but V'ela Shemos b'nei Yisrael. And if you don't have a chumash, it's okay, because I'm not really going to go through a lot of psukim, but V'ela Shemos b'nei Yisrael, these were the names of the children of Israel. Haba'im Mitzrayim, that went down to Mitzrayim, to Egypt. Es Yaakov ish ubeso bohu. And all the children of Yaakov, with all their families, they came. And there's a Rashi. Rashi is a very, I don't know if you guys are learning Rashi. You guys learning Rashi? Probably, I guess, arguably the most famous commentary in Chumash. And he says as follows. I'm trying to see if I need my glasses. If I keep it far enough, I don't need my glasses. But Rashi says the following. It says, Eila Shemos b'nei Yisrael. These are the names of the Jewish people. Afal pisha minayim b'chayeihem b'shmosam. Even though they were counted in their lifetimes by their names. Chozer u'minayim acher misasan. That they went back and they were counted again after they passed away. Lahodia chibasan shenim shalu l'kochavim. To demonstrate the great love that Hashem, that God had for the Jewish people, that he's constantly counting them. We have this theme throughout Chumash in numerous places. He's constantly counting them, and he's comparing them to stars. That's what we're going to talk about in a minute. Shemotziin machnisim b'mispar b'shemos. They come and go, and they're counted both in number and in name. Shenemar, like it says, hamotzi b'mispar tzva'am l'chulam shemos yikro. So says Rav Druk the following. This pasuk, where we talk about these are the names, it's interesting to note that Shemos, the word names, is not only the name of this parsha, this Torah portion, it's the name of the entire book of Shemos. It's the name for the next how many weeks? And oftentimes the name, he says, is the mahus, is the essence of the whole, so to speak, the whole story. Now, what is this idea, says Rav Druk, about being compared to stars? That the Jewish people were counted in number and given names and compared to stars. Anyone have any ideas, any thoughts? Why would the Jewish people be compared to stars? And he gives something very, very interesting. Yes?
Each star is a function.
Each star is a function. Excellent. Excellent.
Everyone's different.
Everyone's different. Amazing.
We're going to shine as bright as every star shines.
Love it. Excellent.
Illuminating the world.
Excellent. You guys have great ideas. So you pretty much hit on it, but I'll add one layer to it. He says it's as follows. It's to show the following. I think it's very apropos. This is the beginning of the whole book of Shemos. He says, when you're counted, let's start there, which is one thing you guys didn't touch on. When you're counted with a number, think about numbers. Numbers are irrelevant if they're not connected to the number before and after. To say that something's number 127, well, what does 127 mean if there doesn't exist a 126 and a 128? So the idea in numbers is as follows, that you're part of something much, much bigger than yourself. The whole Sefer Bereshis is about building ourselves. Now we're moving into the creation of the Jewish people as a nation, and we're privileged to be part of something much, much bigger than ourselves. Yes?
I was going to say, it's like honestly the whole point of Judaism as well. You're just part of something bigger than yourself. That's why it's the most like selfless religion of the three Abraham.
Exactly. I like that a lot. Excellent. So that's the idea in numbers. Another idea in numbers is if you look up at the stars and you see so many stars in the sky, but for each star to have a number, to be counted as part of something bigger than themselves. But at the same time, as a lot of you alluded to, and we say this in our davening every morning, we say that Hashem literally names every star. Lechulam Shemos Yikro. He gives each one a name. When you each have a name, while you're part of something bigger than yourself, while you're part of Judaism, at the same time, each and every one of you and myself, there's no one. What's your name? Ben Sion. What's your last name?
Semyonov.
I'm sorry? Semyono? Ben Sion Semyono. I'm sorry if I didn't say that right. There's only one Ben Sion Semyono in the whole world. Now, that might be literally true, but let's assume for a minute there are other, you may have relatives under the same name. The idea being that each and every one of us, yes, we have, I'll call it a global mission that are similar. We have to keep Shabbos, we want to keep Kashrut, we want to keep the different halachas, but each and every one of us were sent into the world with our own individual mission, our own kochos, our own strengths, our own weaknesses, our own abilities, and I would say it, as a famous saying, the day you were born was the day Hashem, God, decided His world needed you in it, right? Because you're there to serve a certain purpose. You're there to fulfill what we call a tafkid, a mission in life. And each and every one of us has a different tafkid and to fulfill another mission in creation. And therefore, it's an unbelievable thought to think about as we transition from Bereshis to Shemos, that we're part of this awesome nation, but at the same time, just like every single star has its own name, we have our own individual mission. Okay, so that's thought number one on Sefer Shemos, okay? Thought number two. A very, very inspiring idea that I saw a few years ago. I was very fortunate on this trip because I happen to like the writings of different Hasidic Rebbes. That's just my own personal taste. I find them very inspiring. And one of the Sefer, one of the books I like to learn with a few of my friends in Teaneck, so it's called Nesiva Shalom. I know that Rabbi Geffen has heard of it. I don't know if anyone else heard of it. It's a very, very popular book today. Really brings concepts in Hasidus to a basic level for those of us who are not Hasidic Jews, and I'm not. I have the set of Nesiva Shalom at home, but what's beautiful is there's like 7 volumes. It's 5 volumes on the Parshas, on the weekly Torah portions, and 2 volumes on Shabbos and all the holidays. And all the Pesach essays, let's call it, are in a very thick volume. And every year, my wife is from Memphis, Tennessee. So every year we go to Memphis for Pesach to see her family. And I have a passion on Pesach to read the essays of the Rebbe, the Nesiva Shalom, who, by the way, is a pretty recent Rebbe. He was Nifter. He passed away in the year 2000. So it wasn't like he lived 300 years ago. He lived in our times.
We used to take groups there.
Yes. Oh, you took groups there. Interesting. So the Sefer on Pesach is like this big, thick Sefer. But I happened to be at Me'ez Sharm just the other day, and they've, in recent years, been coming out with different sections of his books in like mini pamphlets. So I had this idea when Rabbi Geffen invited me to speak to share this thought I'm about to share with you, because it's the foundation of belief in God. But I didn't bring my Nesiva Shalom with me. My son in Yeshiva and Shalavim actually has it because we learned together on FaceTime. He calls me they finished their night seder. They're learning at night at about 10:30, 11 o'clock at night. And a couple days a week, my son will then FaceTime with me back in America. He's here this year. And we'll learn together for 20, 30 minutes. And sometimes we'll learn Nesiva Shalom. So I was going to have him bring it, but I found this nice little pamphlet which just takes all the pieces on Pesach. Okay. I love this. I stumbled on this, I'll call it essay, this writing from the Nesiva Shalom, probably about 5 or 6 years ago. And every single year when we come to Pesach, I come back to it. Now, why am I using the liberty to share this with you today? Aside from the fact that I think it's very inspiring, I think it fits into our Chumash year, because this comes from Parshas Beshalach, which is in Shemos. A little poetic license, is that okay? All right. So we say in the davening every morning, and it's a pasuk, it's a verse directly from Beshalach. So if you are following along, you're welcome to skip ahead to Parshas Beshalach. If you can find it, I don't know if I know the exact pasuk, but it's right before the splitting of the sea, the Kriyas Yamsuf. The Jewish people we've already finished the slavery in Egypt. We've had the 10 plagues, which was arguably amongst the greatest miracles in the history of Jewish history. We're now coming to the sea. We're being chased by the Egyptians, and Hashem is about to perform maybe the biggest miracle in history. And actually, Hashem does. I think this comes right after Kriyas Yamsuf, right around there. You have the Chumash, you can check. And then the Torah says, and we say this every morning in davening, we say the following. We say, and I'm not sure which pasuk, which verse it is, but maybe you'll find it. We say, Vayar Yisrael es hayad hagdola asher asa Hashem b'Mitzrayim. the Jewish people saw the great hand, the powerful hand, and in other words, the miracles of what God performed in Egypt. Vayiru ha'am es Hashem, and the Jewish people now had, they saw it, and they developed a healthy fear of God, let's call it. Vayaminu b'Hashem u'Moshe avdo. And now they developed emunah, faith in God, and in Moshe, his servant. We say that right before the Jewish people sing the Shira. They praise Hashem, and we sing Az Yashir, which we say every morning in our davening. So the Yeshivat Shalom asks what I think is two amazing questions. First and foremost, he says, Vayar, the Jewish people saw the great hand of God, and then they developed belief in God, like a real belief in God. So we're taught very often that one of the merits that allowed Hashem, God, to take us out of Egypt in the first place was we had a certain level of emunah, of faith in God. And as I don't want to say a reward, but as a outcome of that emunah, that was one of the things that merited us to be taken out of Egypt in the first place. So ask the Yeshivat Shalom, what do you mean the Jewish people now see the miracles God's performing and therefore now believes in God? I thought the Jewish people already believed in God in Egypt. Interesting question, right? Okay, fine. Question number two. I asked the questions in reverse order, but it's okay. Why would you say Vayar, that the Jewish people saw these great miracles and then they had faith, they had emunah? Think for a second, what does faith mean? What is faith? Yes?
Faith is having the belief that it will happen instead of seeing it first.
Okay, good.
It just means like you're a believer. You have conviction about an idea or something.
Excellent. So you guys hit the nail on the head. If I don't see something with my own eyes, but I have very powerful, strong, convincing reason to know that it's true, I have faith that this thing is true. I don't know with 100,000% certainty, but my emunah, my faith is really, really strong, and I believe it. I really believe it very strongly. But this idea of that the Jewish people first saw the miracles, and now they develop faith. If I saw it with my own eyes, I don't need to have faith. I know it. I see it. I know Rabbi Geffen sitting right next to me. I don't have to have faith in that. I see him right here, right? So that's another interesting question as well. And it's a whole long essay, but I'll just give you the quick gist of this because I think it's very, very powerful. Says the Yeshivat Shalom, there are 3 levels of emunah, of faith. The first level is what he refers to as, and different commentaries will have, similar ideas with a little bit different lingo. I'm just using the Yeshivat Shalom's lingo here. He says the first level is what he calls emunas hamoach, intellectual faith. And we'll come back to that in a minute. The second level is emunas halev, emunah in my heart. And the third level, he says, is emunas ha'ivarim, which means the emunah is seeped into my limbs. It's in every part of my body. I can't live without it. Now he says, interesting, the gap, the distance between emunas hamoach, intellectual emunah, and emunas halev is a huge gap. Let me give you an example, okay? I'm not a smoker, but I always think Rav Weinberg has used this example on many occasions, and it really resonates with me. I don't think I guess it's now 2024, 5784. I didn't really feel that here in Israel, which is good. When I'm usually in America, it's like, New Year is this and that. Other than the fact that I think Hamas, Yimach Shemam, their name should be erased, sent a bunch of rockets right at 12 o'clock last night. I really forgot that it was even like the secular New Year last night. But in 2024, I don't think you'll find anybody, and I apologize if anyone in this room falls into this category. I don't mean it personally. I don't think anybody doesn't know at this point in time that smoking is not good for your health. Pretty much everyone knows that, right? That's emunas hamoach, intellectual. I know intellectually it's not a good thing to do. But how often does that actually stop a smoker from smoking? I mean, maybe some people, but not a lot of people. Because those people maybe have an intellectual idea that it's not a good thing, but they're not living with that idea in their kishkas, in their gut, in their bones, in their DNA. You know what I'm saying? I'll give you an example that applies to myself. I lose a lot of weight, I gain a little weight, I go back and forth, and I'm always trying to beat myself up over it. I know intellectually I should watch what I eat. I should eat a healthy diet. I should exercise properly. And there are times where I am good at that, and there are times I'm not. because I'm not yet successful in like living with that in my DNA, and I have to work on that, you know. And the same thing is true for belief in God. So we're all in this room on different stages of our, I'll call it our Jewish journey. I'm no different. You know, I'm trying to grow at the age of 50 and become more attached to my learning and more attached to God. I wasn't always this way. I was always an Orthodox Jew, by the way, but I went many, many years as I left Yeshivat University and got married, had a family, started building my career, started traveling. You know, what happens in life, and you know, I think most of you in the room, a little older than, not everybody, but most of you. What happens in life is that, you know, I like to think of it as like you're in a little rowboat in the middle of the ocean. If you're paddling very, very hard to go in the direction you want, you'll be successful. But if you're not really paddling hard, the ocean's just going to keep pulling you and pulling you away. You know, the other classic example is like trying to go up a down escalator. You know, if you're just standing there not really growing, you're moving backwards. You really have to work hard to climb. And that's really what life is. So I definitely went a lot of years where I was not as attached spiritually as I would have liked, not as committed as I would have liked. And, you know, it's never too late to grow in life. You always want to keep growing. So this idea of, from Parshas Beshalach, by Kriyas Yamsuf, by the splitting of the sea, that yes, it's true, the Jewish people had emunah, had faith in Egypt, but it was intellectual emunah. It wasn't yet, they weren't living with it. They weren't living with the idea of God. They intellectually knew about God. They believed intellectually in the idea of God. But it was only here, by the splitting of the sea, by Kriyas Yamsuf, where the incredible, unbelievable miracles that they saw, it was so powerful, so convincing, their emunah went to the deepest level. It became emunas. It became completely emunas ha'evarim, emunah of their faith. And that's why it says, Vayar, now the Jewish people saw, and now their incredible emunah grew. Interesting idea, right? And I think this is something we could really take into our lives. You're all here for a reason. And there's not time for me right now to go through each of your stories. But I have no doubt, Rabbi Geffen's been introducing me to people in the hallway as I walk around the building, and everybody has an unbelievable story. So we each have a story why we're here today, including myself. I'm here for a few hours. We want to be here for something. There's something we're trying to get out of this place, right? And as we continue on that journey, it's good to keep in mind from Parshas Beshalach the idea that I may intellectually start developing my belief in God and my belief in being a more observant Jew, but I got to keep working at it to get to the point where I'm living with it. And when you're living with it, there's no stopping you. Because like we said in the parable, in the mashal in the beginning, you're searching for that lost Niggun. The only way to find that lost Niggun and satisfy your soul is when you develop that emunah tremendously. The next idea, had a piece of paper here a minute ago, but it's okay. The next idea, oh here, I don't know. The next idea, oh it's underneath. The next idea comes from Parshas Yisro, okay? Beshalach, then comes Yisro. The father-in-law of Moshe, here we go. And another very, very nice idea that I saw in Rav Druk's Sefer, and I think it's something that we could really take inspiration from, okay? So, the very beginning of Parshas Yisro, and Yisro was not Jewish and converted to Judaism, okay? And it says the following, and you can see it in the beginning of Parshas Yisro. Vayishma Yisro koin midyan chose Moshe, and Yisro, the father-in-law of Moshe, heard, Eis kol asher asa Elokim leMoshe u'Yisrael. He heard everything that God did for the Jewish people and for Moshe. Ki yotzi Hashem es Yisrael mitzrayim, that Hashem took them out of Mitzrayim. Rashi, on this very verse, asks the following. It says, Mashmua, what is it that Yisro heard? Because the pasuk's not totally clear. The verse isn't clear. Mashmua uva v'nizgayer. What did he hear that inspired him to actually join the Jewish people and convert? And it says, there's different commentaries who answer this question. Rav Druk quotes Rabbi Eliezer Hamodai, which is quoted in the Talmud in the Gemara, who says a unique idea. He says, what did he hear? He heard about the story of Matan Torah, that the Torah was given to the Jewish people. Now, most commentaries, I think including Rashi, say differently. Say that what did he hear? He heard about they came out of Mitzrayim, Egypt, all the miracles, the splitting of the sea, all these unbelievable things. And Yisro says, this is a people that I need to join. And that's, I think, the majority of commentaries do say that. But the Gemara, the Talmud, quotes this Rabbi Eliezer Hamodai, who has a unique approach, and he says, what did Yisro hear? He heard about the giving of the Torah. Rav Druk says an amazing thing. There's a concept that when the Jewish people were in Egypt, in slavery, they were ensconced in tumah, in impurity. so much so that they reached the 49th level of tumah, of impurity. And when you reach the 50th level of impurity, it's like there's no going back. You're finished. They were on the, like almost like the last breath before there was no turning back. And that's the moment when they were taken out of Mitzrayim and the whole miracle of the splitting of the sea. And then 49 days later, they come to Mount Sinai and they're given the Torah, and it's a game changer. And everything changes, right? The idea being, says Rav Druk, Yisro, if you want to say according to the commentaries who said it was the miracles and all these different things, Yisro could have said to himself, you know what? I've been an idol worshiper. I've been doing the wrong thing all my life. I'm not worthy of being a part of the Jewish people in any real way. But when he heard that 7 weeks later they can go from the 49th level of impurity all the way to Mount Sinai to receiving the Torah in 7 weeks, think about how fast we could turn our lives around. How quick we can change our lives from being not in a place where we want to be to being like an inspired Jew. Now, I'm not an expert here at Ohr Somayach. You have real experts, so I defer to them. But my limited understanding and my experience is it's always very good to make sure you don't go from step 1 to step 10 overnight. You have to build the foundation, right? It's always healthy to go one step at a time, right? Geffen, feel free to disagree, but build one step at a time and make sure you really have a strong foundation to keep building as you grow along your path. You know, if you take on like way too much overnight, it's very hard to sustain that. But the idea being, balance that idea with the concept that Yisro saw, that the Jewish people went in 7 weeks from like the worst level of impurity in Egypt to being at Mount Sinai, getting the Torah. He says, wow, if the Jewish people can do that, I can also go from being an idol worshiper, I can also be worthy and have an opportunity to be part of this people. And that, says this opinion, Rabbi Lazar Hamodai, that is the reason that Yisro felt very inspired. And I think what we can take out of that in our lives, I don't think anyone here is on the 49th level of impurity, but the idea being that every day is a new day. We say every morning, I'm a Chadesh Betuvo, B'chol Yom Tamid Ma'aser Bereishis. Every day Hashem, like God recreates the world. We have a new opportunity. Yesterday was yesterday. The next morning is a new opportunity. And we can literally go from being unworthy on the 49th level of Tumah to being standing at Mount Sinai, at Har Sinai, and getting the Torah. A few more things. What do we have, about 10 more minutes, right, Geffen? Something like that? Is that right? Okay. A few more ideas. Further along in Parshas Yisro, we have the famous receiving of the Torah, receiving of the Ten Commandments. Very, very famous. But there's one particular idea that I'm very inspired by. In honor of being at Ohr Somayach today, one of the great Jewish thinkers that in the last year or two I've become very, very inspired by is Rabbi Dr. Akiva Tatz, who I think has a lot of history here at Ohr Somayach. I think he's from South Africa as well. My son, my oldest son, 7 years ago when he was in Yeshivat Shalavim, he says to me, Dad, I read an unbelievable book. Now, if anyone in this room has not yet read this book, if there's nothing else you took out of anything I said today, go buy this book, because that alone will change your life. So I think one of Rabbi Tatz's most well-known books is called Living Inspired by Rabbi Akiva Tatz. My son read it 7 years ago in Yeshiva, and he said to me, Dad, it's life-changing, you got to read it. And I kept saying, I have 1 million books next to my bed that I want to read. And it was one of 1 million books. And I said, I'm going to read it. But, the years went by and I never read it. And I don't know why. Last January, we went on a vacation with my wife and my kids to Florida. I grabbed that book. I don't know why I took it. And I read it. I read it 2 times in a row. And I think I may read it again pretty soon. I think I've read about 5 of his other books ever since then. And this is an idea, Living Inspired. You got to read it. World Mask, another unbelievable book. World Mask. The Anatomy of a Search. Got to read that book. He's also a doctor by training. So the Anatomy of a Search plays on the medical, the anatomy of the body, so to speak. But the idea of, I think it was actually based on stories here at Ohr Somayach, largely, when he was teaching here. And a lot of guys would come, some of them older, some of them post-college, very, very smart, many times not yet affiliated or just early in their journey. And they would come in with a lot of questions about God. I wouldn't say challenges, but healthy questions, and they would often give those very challenging cases to Rabbi Tatz to sit with those people over a period of months or weeks and have conversations. And he wrote about a lot of those stories in Anatomy of a Search, and just really a brilliant book. All right, so back to Parshas Yisro and Rabbi Akiva Tatz, he presents the following in his book, Living Inspired. He says the following. There's a teaching that sleep, maybe some of you have heard this, sleep is considered 1/60th of death. You ever hear that before? Sleep is considered 1/60th of misa of death. He says dreams are considered 1/60th of nevuah, of prophecy. And Shabbos is 1/60th of olam haba, of what we're going to experience in the next world, the spiritual world. Very interesting idea. But says Rabbi Tatz, what is this idea of 1/60th? Why do we keep hearing that's like a strange number, right? 1/60th. 1/60th is a very, very important number in Jewish law, in Jewish halacha. One example of it is in the laws of kashrus, of kosher food. There's a concept of batel b'shishim. If we have, and correct me if I'm not saying this correctly, if we have a pot of meat or chicken soup or whatever the case may be, and let's say accidentally a drop of milk falls into this pot, and you go to the rabbi and you say, is this soup kosher? So the idea is, if there's less than 1/60th in that of milk that falls into the pot, we call it batel. It's nullified amongst the much bigger soup. You can't taste it, and it's kosher. If you have more than 1/60th, now it's considered a problem and it's not kosher. And what is the idea, says Rabbi Tatz? 1/60th is the measurement, is the border of what we call a mashahu, like a substance. It's discernible. The milk is discernible in that meat pot if it's more than a ratio of 1/60th. But at less than that, it's not discernible, it's kosher. Very interesting how Rabbi Tatz relates this back to the idea of Shabbos. And I'm saying this here because in Parshas Yisro, right before the Ten Commandments, we have the whole section where Hashem is talking about the great gift of Shabbos, our obligation to keep it for all generations. So here's the idea. Shabbos is a tremendous gift from Hashem, from God. As we start becoming more observant and growing in our Jewish journey, and we start hopefully being more meticulous with our Shabbos observance, we find it changes our entire life for many, many reasons. That's another whole class in itself. But the idea is as follows, says Rabbi Tatz. The gift of Shabbos is coming whether you do anything or not. It's coming every week. Every 7 days, we light candles, Shabbos is there, even if you don't do anything. But here's the idea. Shabbos is 1/60th of olam haba, of the next world. That's if you don't do anything. It's right there. You're not really doing much with it. But if you start to increase the ratio, the 1/60th, you start adding to your Shabbos, you start putting your heart and soul into Shabbos, you sing Zmiros, songs at the table. I try to do that with my kids every week. You talk about the weekly parsha, the weekly Torah portion. You tell inspirational stories. You go to shul. You are now adding to your 1/60th, and now you're going to start tasting a little bit of what olam haba really is in this world. But if you don't make that effort, the idea being, in Judaism, I think in general, it's like any relationship. The more effort we put in, the more we add to our 1/60th, the more we're going to taste the reward. But if we don't do anything, we just allow it to come and go, it's okay. It's like it's there, but we don't really do very much with it. Okay, I'm running against the clock. I want to move to the end of Shemos now and share with you, I've been waiting for this. I actually debated starting with what I'm about to say, because this alone, I think, changed my life in certain ways, but it comes at the very end of Sefer Shemos. So I was going to start with it, but I figured let's leave it for the end, okay? There is a medrash, a teaching, that is my favorite medrash. And midrashim are not necessarily always, I don't know, Rabbi Geffen, correct me again here, but not necessarily are the stories, did they happen exactly the way the Medrash is presenting it, but these are deep teachings that we are meant to learn lessons from these different Midrashim. So I am privileged every Thursday morning in Teaneck. I think Rabbi Geffen has come to our Friday morning Sfas Emes, another Hasidic Rebbe. We have a group of us, it's up to about 18 guys now every Friday at 5:15 in the morning. 5:15 in the morning every Friday. We study Sfas Emes on the Parsha. During COVID, we started a new group on Thursday mornings, also with Rabbi Roberts. We study a Sefer, a book called Bas Ayin. Bas Ayin is another Hasidic Rebbe who lived in the 1800s. I see somebody, you have right there, the Dvar Torah of Rav Meilech Biederman. You guys have heard of Rav Biederman? That's what you're reading, Torah Wellsprings right there, right? Have you read that regularly?
Yeah.
Okay, you know Rav Biederman? Okay, that's Rav Biederman. He doesn't speak English, so somebody translated it. He lives here in Yerushalayim. Rabbi Deepening, I don't know if you know, he made the study of Bas Ayin a very popular thing in recent years. He says that if you study the Sefer Bas Ayin and you make a Suda, a festive meal on his anniversary of his yard site when he passed away, like people have seen unbelievable positive things happen in their lives. So he's really popularized the learning of Bas Ayin. Okay, so we have this group every Thursday morning, 5:15 in the morning. We study Bas Ayin. Last year, when we got to the very end of Sefer Shemos, so I'm now going to cover the last 5 parshas in one swing. Okay, we got to the very end of Sefer Shemos. The Bas Ayin quoted the following medrash. It's a mind-boggling medrash. Mind-boggling in that it's such I'll call it such an out-there medrash. It's very hard to understand what the medrash is trying to teach us. And every commentary has their own interpretation of it. The Bas Ayin has his. We learned this medrash with Rabbi Roberts. We talked about what the Bas Ayin says about it, and we went about our day. I don't know why this struck me later in the day, and this has been living with me ever since. I kept thinking about there's got to be something deeper here. And in my mind, I'll give you my interpretation of the Bas Ayin's interpretation, and it's changed everything of how I look at Judaism. Okay? So here it is. Here's the medrash. It's a little bit of an out there medrash. The medrash says the following. When Shlomo HaMelech, King Solomon, completed the building of the Beis HaMikdash, the temple, built this beautiful Beis HaMikdash, there were 2 birds sitting on the roof of the Beis HaMikdash. And they were having a conversation. Again, it's a medrash. Doesn't mean it was literal. One bird says to the other bird, you see this unbelievable building, this unbelievable edifice, this Beis HaMikdash? The bird says, just know that with one tenuah, with one slight movement, I can bring the whole thing down. Interesting. Says the Medrash, Shlomo HaMelech, King Solomon, overheard this conversation of the birds, walks outside, looks up and turns to the bird who made that comment and said, I don't understand. We built this temple, this Beis HaMikdash, on the foundation of Torah and chesed and charity and mitzvos. We built this on the good stuff. Why are you saying that with one movement you could bring it all down? The Medrash ends with the bird turning to Shlomo HaMelech, to King Solomon, and saying, excuse me, this is a private conversation between me and my friend, my fellow bird. It doesn't involve you. Stay out of it. That's the end of the Medrash. And Midrashim don't come for no reason. So what are we supposed to take from this story? Okay? I'll give you what the Bas Ayin teaches, and when I thought about what the Bas Ayin said, I thought this was absolutely brilliant. Okay? Now let me give you a one piece of background, maybe 2 pieces of background. Every Sefer, certainly the Hasidic ones, each Rebbe sort of has his path. If you study his writings, you come up with a similar theme in a lot of his writings. They're always bringing every parsha, every Torah portion back to the same theme. The Bas Ayin's whole path in life was what we call in Hebrew anivus and shiflus, humility and sort of bringing ourselves down to a lower level, to be humble. That's basically the whole path of the Bas Ayin. With that background, the Bas Ayin says as follows. The Bas Ayin says, what is this whole story? He says the 2 birds that don't involve Shlomo Melech, it's a private conversation. This represents husband and wife behind closed doors. Doesn't involve anyone else. It's a complete private conversation. If even in such a private conversation that nobody other than husband and wife are going to hear about, if even an ounce of haughtiness, gaiva, slips in, the whole structure is going to crumble. That's an interesting way to look at it. I think it's a powerful teaching. He's saying it really represents that you have to be so humble in life and so careful not to be arrogant that even in a private conversation, a drop of arrogance can bring down even the whole Beis HaMikdash. That's the Bas Ayin. And I think it's a nice teaching. But I kept thinking about this and thinking there's got to be more to this. And I thought of the following. I don't know if you guys will like this or not. So let's backtrack. This comes at the very end of Sefer Shemos. We'll conclude with this, okay? 5 weeks earlier, we had the following famous pasuk, the following famous verse. Maybe you guys have heard this. God commands the Jewish people, V'asu li mikdash, build for me a dwelling place, v'shachanti b'socham. Build for me a house, let's call it, in your physical world, so that I, God, could come down and dwell amongst you. Now, thousands of years ago, how did the Jewish people fulfill that commandment? They built a physical mishkan, a tabernacle, and later a physical Beis HaMikdash. And that was, let's call it, the house of God. That's where God lived with us. But the Torah, and this is what I want to leave you with this thought. The Torah is not meant to be a history book. The Torah is meant to apply to our lives today. Every word of Torah today, if we can't figure out how it applies to our life, go to some of the very smart people who are in Ohr Somayach, and maybe they can help you, because everything in the Torah applies to our lives. So if everything applies to our lives, how today in 5784, 2024, are we able to fulfill God's commandment of build for me a dwelling place so I can dwell amongst you? Okay? So here's what I think the Bas Yayin is really teaching us. And by the way, right after that Yasuli Mikdash commandment, the last 5 parshas of the whole Sefer Shemos, if you skim through the English, it's all the details of the building of the Mishkan, the building of the tabernacle. 5 straight weeks of every detail, every inch about it. Okay? So, thousands of years ago, we built a physical Mishkan, but how do we do it today? So stay with me at this last thought, and we'll end with this, okay? What is gaiva? What is haughtiness? What is arrogance? On the surface, arrogance is somebody who's just, he's a show-off. He's just an arrogant person. Nobody wants to be around arrogant people. They're not pleasant, right? So I'm not going to be around an arrogant person. If arrogance comes in, everything falls apart. That we understand. But let's dig a lot deeper. That's a term Rabbi Tatz always says. Let's dig deeper. What is the real root of arrogance? If you really think about it, arrogance is really denying, at minimum, denying God's involvement in my life, denying God's providence over my life, and at most, maybe it's entirely denying God. Why? Because if I'm arrogant, my success is because of my talents, it's all because of me, I'm the best, I'm saying it's all due to me, it's not due to God. I'm not living with God in my life. But if I live a life where I recognize that my talents, my abilities come from God, my success comes from God, and everything in my life, I'm connected to God, I'm living a godly life, what I'm really doing is I'm creating space in my life for God to live with me. But if I don't create that space and I think it's all me, I'm denied. It's the opposite of Amunah in God. So what I think the Bas Yayin is really teaching us is as follows. Thousands of years ago, we built a physical Mishkan. We spent 5 weeks learning the details. It was so important to allow God to live in our lives. Today, we don't have a physical Mishkan or Beis HaMikdash. How do we live with God? How do we fulfill His commandment of building a house for God? Create space in our life, but real space for God to live in our lives. Recognize every single day in everything we do, the godliness in our lives. I'll end with one story about this. My grandfather, my maternal grandfather was my hero in my life. I can come and give 5 lectures just on that. But I'll tell you one thing about him. He was born in 1900. He passed away in 2001. He was born in Kashitsa in Eastern Europe. And he had 4 children. He lost 3 children in the Holocaust. He lost his wife. He lost his family, his parents, lost a lot. Came to America, rebuilt, married my mother's mother, who passed away of cancer, got married again. This was his life. But to his last day, he woke up at 4 o'clock every morning to study Talmud, to study Gemara for hours. Then he went to work, came home, and my grandfather was somebody who could speak to the greatest rabbis about anything in Torah and speak on their level. He could speak to the greatest businessman about anything in business and speak on their level. He could speak to the greatest politician about anything going on in the world. He was this worldly, this was who my grandfather was. So I want to give you one example that I learned from my grandfather about this, and we'll conclude, about living with God in your life. When I was a teenager, I was not as inspired as I would have liked to have been. And I would go to shul, to a synagogue on Shabbos, but not during the week as much. Nowadays, I try to go 3 times a day, but not at that time. I remember one time I was going out at 6 in the morning to play golf. My grandparents were staying at my parents' summer home in the Catskill Mountains. And I was leaving. I used to like to tee off, if you're golfers, right? I used to like to tee off at sunrise. Like the sun is rising, the birds are chirping, and you go out and play golf. And I was tiptoeing out of the house at about 6 in the morning. And my grandfather, who was well into his 90s at that time, was sitting like in the other room studying Gemara, studying Talmud, and he heard me. And he calls me over and he says the following. He says to me, look in the backyard. I look out in the backyard, the sun is rising, and I see a row of deer. And the deer are walking one behind the other like in a single file line. My grandfather makes the following comment that I will never forget. He says to me, how great is HaKadosh Baruch Hu? How great is God that He created deer with this instinct? Why do they walk one behind the other? So that when they encounter a hunter, they're in single file line. The hunter can only hit the first one. So my grandfather looked at this, which I wouldn't even have noticed, and said, how great is God that He created a deer with this instinct to walk? And that was his comment. I left and I went to play golf. And all these years later, that probably happened over 30 years ago. That's the greatest example to me of someone who lived every second with God in his life. Everything he saw in the world, it was the hand of God. That's living with God, creating space for God in our lives. And that's, I think, what the Bas Yayin was teaching us. Thank you very much.